Do you believe in setting boundaries, even if it means losing people?
I was not invited to dinner. Not because I was sick, not because I had done something terrible, but because in the twisted logic of my family, I did not qualify as successful enough to sit at the same table where the achievers gathered, clinked their wine glasses, and congratulated themselves for lives polished to look flawless on the outside. That was the official reason I learned in the most humiliating way possible. My mother called me earlier that afternoon to ask a casual question about something completely unrelated, and when I mentioned I was free in the evening, she hesitated, just for a second too long before saying, "Oh well. It's more of a gathering for those with established careers." Her pause was longer than the sentence itself, and in that space, I heard all the things she didn't say. That I was not established. That I was not worth bragging about. That my presence would somehow stain the carefully curated illusion of accomplishment she and my father wanted to project. To the neighbors, the in-laws, the people who never stopped measuring success in job titles, car models, and investment portfolios. The truth is, I could have confronted her right then. I could have shouted down the phone, listed every late night I had worked, every sacrifice I had made, every risk I had taken to build the thing that no one in my family ever believed in. But I didn't. I just let her silence sit there, cutting sharper than anything she could have spoken aloud. I answered with a flat, "Sure, no problem," and hung up, pretending it didn't matter, pretending that this was just another evening like any other. But it mattered, and the hollow pit in my stomach proved it. So I ordered takeout. Nothing glamorous, just greasy noodles from the small place down the street that always wrote my name wrong on the bag. I sat in my apartment, staring at the white carton containers, the plastic fork bending under the weight of too much sauce, and I thought about the smell of roasted chicken and wine that was probably filling my parents' dining room. I could picture the laughter echoing across the polished wood table, my father bragging about David's promotion, my mother clapping her hands dramatically when someone mentioned a friend's son making partner at a firm. I knew exactly how the script would play out because I had lived it too many times before, only this time I wasn't even offered a seat in the audience. As I scrolled through social media with one hand and pushed cold noodles into my mouth with the other, I stumbled across the photos already starting to surface. My brother's smug smile, the cousins raising their glasses, the caption reading, "Family dinner celebrating achievements." I zoomed in until I could see the corner of the table, the empty space where I might have been sitting if my life had been judged worthy enough. My chest tightened, but instead of crying, I laughed. A sharp, bitter laugh that sounded like it belonged to someone else. I laughed because it was so absurd, so cartoonish in its cruelty, that the only thing left to do was treat it like a bad joke. I leaned back on my couch, wiped soy sauce from my lip, and thought about all the times I had been told, directly and indirectly, that I was not measuring up. When I started my company, they said it was a hobby. When I worked from a coffee shop, they called it unemployment with Wi-Fi. When I didn't post vacations or cars, they whispered that maybe I was struggling. And through it all, I said nothing, because sometimes silence is easier than fighting with people who have already decided you are invisible. That night, I felt invisible. I felt erased from the very family tree that was supposed to protect me. I let the TV play in the background, some mindless show with canned laughter, and I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. But even as I closed the curtains and shoved them into the trash, the sting remained. I wasn't angry that they had dinner without me. I was angry that they made it so clear, so intentional, so unashamedly public, that I didn't belong. I stood by the window, looking out at the glow of other apartments, wondering how many people inside those windows were also eating alone, also feeling like the outsiders in their own families. And for a brief moment, I pitied myself, the kind of pity I swore I would never indulge in. Then I whispered out loud, almost to test if my voice still worked, "They really think I'm nothing." The words came out calm, steady, with just enough of a tremor to reveal the truth beneath them. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined as they sipped their wine and patted each other on the back, was that the world was about to hear my name before sunrise. And when it did, their silence would suddenly become very, very loud. The cartons were still stacked on the coffee table like pale little monuments to my lowered expectations when I shut off the sitcom laugh track and let the room breathe, and in that quiet, the memories started filing in with the punctuality of people who love being the first to arrive, each one holding a name tag that said something like comparison or disappointment. Or that charming family pastime where someone makes a joke at your expense and then demands you be a good sport about it because the joke was a compliment in disguise, which, translated into plain English, meant it was an insult with a ribbon. I remembered the graduation where my brother shook hands with a dean and my mother looked at me the way people look at airline seats that do not recline, and I remembered the Christmas when an aunt asked whether my little project had become an actual job yet, stretching the word actual like taffy until it snapped, and I remembered the phone call where my father, thinking he was being helpful, told me that persistence was admirable but delusion could wear this same outfit, and if I ever needed help finding something stable, there were people who owed him favors. I carried my bowl to the sink and ran the water hotter than necessary, watching the steam climb and blur the window, and as the glass fogged, I noticed how easily the outside world disappeared when the inside world got too warm. And I realized that was the problem with my family. We were a house that kept the thermostat set to pride and locked the windows in case a draft of humility got in, and if you could not breathe in that air, the house decided you were the problem. I dried the bowl with the sort of care we reserve for things that are not actually fragile, but will shatter anyway if we throw them, then opened my laptop and checked the email that had dropped an hour earlier. The one from the communications director with the schedule for the morning embargo, the one that said someone from National Business News had requested comment and that we should keep our statements clean and unglamorous, the one that reminded me, with absurd tenderness, that my name would soon be pronounced correctly by people who did not share my last name. It would have been easy to blast a message into the family group chat, to paste the press release, to write something poisonous and theatrical that would make me feel triumphant for exactly 20 minutes and mortified for the rest of my life. Because the thing about revenge is that it spoils fast when it is served hot and noisy, and I have learned, painfully and slowly, that the most lasting flavor comes from letting it cool until it cuts clean. So I did what I do best when everyone assumes I am powerless. I made a small plan that looked like nothing from the outside and felt like oxygen on the inside. A plan born not out of malice, but out of the stubborn wish to put an honest label on a dishonest night. First, I pulled up the restaurant's number from the photo my cousin had posted, the one where the logo glowed behind their heads like a halo for entrees, and I called with the level voice I reserve for fundraising and negotiating and other adult theater, explaining to the hostess that I wanted to send a dessert to a specific table. Yes, the one with the family celebrating achievements. Yes, I knew that was half the restaurant tonight, but this table would be the one with my mother who talks with her hands and a son who thinks collars are personality, and when the hostess laughed softly and found them anyway, I asked for a single slice of the most decadent chocolate thing they had, sent with a note that said, "For those with established careers. Compliments of the unsuccessful one trying to learn the recipe," a line that managed to be truthful, ridiculous, and generous all at once, which is my favorite chemistry. Then I did something smaller that felt somehow larger, because petty is a scale and not a destination. I opened our family calendar app, the one we pretend to use for logistics, but actually use to track hierarchical seating. And I created an event for myself that read "Dinner with People Who Value Me," and I set it to repeat every week at the same time as their Achievers Night. Not because I plan to eat alone forever, not because I need technology to remind me of my dignity, but because it amused me to imagine the quiet alarm chiming in my pocket whenever someone plotted a new way to explain why I did not qualify, and because sometimes the best revenge is to give your future self a small, scheduled promise that you will not keep auditioning for a seat that requires you to amputate your whole personality to fit the chair. While I waited for the dessert to land like a polite meteor, I thought about calling my brother to warn him that the economy has a way of humbling people who build forts out of titles. And I thought about calling my mother to say that I missed the version of her who believed in me before belief needed a spreadsheet, and I thought about calling my father to tell him that, yes, stability is lovely, But there are many ways to build a bridge, and some of them are not on the map yet, and I said none of it because I finally understood that they would hear every word only when the microphone was not mine, when a stranger was holding it, when the world was nodding for them and not for me. My phone buzzed, and for a moment I hoped it was the hostess sending back a wink, but it was a voicemail from my mother recorded earlier, a rambly thing about centerpieces and seating, casual and breezy. Like someone describing the weather and not the weather system that had decided I was outside of it, so I deleted it without listening to the end, which felt like nothing and like everything, and then another buzz came through, this time from the comms director, confirming the timing and the outlet and the phrasing, all of it measured and careful, all of it pointing to a morning that would arrive whether I slept or paced. When the delivery confirmation finally arrived, I pictured the slice sliding onto their table, the candle lit, the note opened, the brief pause while they processed the flavor of a message that was not begging for their approval and not choking on resentment either. Just placing a small mirror at the center of the table and walking away, and I felt something unclench in my chest, something like a laugh that had decided to grow up and become a boundary. I locked my door, closed the curtains, set my phone to silence, and let the darkness settle the way fresh snow settles on a road no one thinks to plow, and in that quiet, I understood that the only applause I would ever require was the sound a life makes when it refuses to keep auditioning, and as the apartment exhaled, the city flickered, and the clock moved without asking permission. I realized that the world was turning its face toward morning, which meant the cameras were already warming up. And the names were already being practiced. And if my family had not seen me tonight, they would hear me soon enough. The announcement did not arrive with trumpets or a marching band or any of the noisy rituals my family adores when an accomplishment can be counted on a cake. It arrived in the quiet way big things often arrive when you are alone in a room that finally believes you. A calendar invite ticking over to the top of the hour, a red light at the bottom corner of a television screen changing from local chatter to national business, a producer's voice in my ear confirming that the embargo had cleanly lifted and that the segment would open with the aerial shot of our campus, and then cut to my interview where I am smiling in that measured way I learned from people who never want to be caught gloating, even when the numbers justify a victory lap. I had not planned to watch it live because I wanted to protect the small shell of calm I had managed to grow around myself after the dessert stunt, but when the anchor began saying my name the way teachers say it the first time they realize the kid in the back has an answer worth hearing, I sat down on the edge of the couch and let the world in. The screen filled with footage we had supplied, ordinary images made extraordinary by the context of the deal, engineers walking through a hallway that looked like sunlight had decided to stay for a career. Our beta product in the hands of people who were not paid to pretend they liked it, and then there I was, the me from 2 days ago under studio lights, explaining why the partnership mattered for the market and for customers who had been promised the moon by companies that never bothered to build a staircase, and even though I knew every line I was about to say, the words struck me differently in my own living room, because hearing yourself talk about resilience while last night's humiliation is still cooling on the counter is a very specific flavor, bitter and bright at the same time, like grapefruit with a secret. The anchor pivoted to the number because of course he did, the way a fisherman eventually talks about the weight of the catch, because it is easier than describing the river. And when he said $120 million with the careful relish of someone tasting a syllable that pays their mortgage, I realized that my body had been waiting for that exact articulation. Not because the number changes who I am, but because it changes what everyone else thinks they know about who I am, and there is something unavoidably funny about that if you let yourself see it. So I did, I laughed, a long careful laugh that stayed behind my teeth and warmed the room without setting anything on fire. They cut to my closing quote, the line I wrote it to in the morning after a day that would have broken an earlier version of me, a line the comms team thought was risky because it was not the usual corporate frosting, and there it was, sliding into living rooms across the country while my parents raised glasses around a table I was not invited to. I built this by learning to work when no one was clapping, and I am grateful to the people who taught me how to eat alone without losing my appetite for the work, which is about as close as you can get to saying thank you and screw it at the same time without earning a censor. The anchor smiled, the cheer-in lingered, the credits for the segment rolled like a curtain that knows it closed on the right scene, and the producer texted me a simple, "You landed it," which felt like a medal pinned on the inside of a jacket where only you can feel the weight. I did not post anything triumphant because triumph posted too loud becomes a dare, and I had no interest in inviting a duel with people who fight with confetti, but I did update the quote on my professional page with a line that would look, to strangers, like a motivational plank, and to the only audience that mattered tonight, like a mirror angled just so, to everyone who sat me at the kids' table until I stopped asking for a chair, thank you for the view, and I set the privacy to public. Because subtlety does not require secrecy, it requires timing. Then I opened the draft of a thank you email to our team and replaced the boilerplate with a paragraph that named 3 quiet contributors who never appear in photographs because someone has to keep the lens steady, and I pressed send because the best revenge, when you can afford it, is to flood the places you control with the kind of fairness you were denied. Before I turned off the television, they reran the headline on the bottom banner, my name welded to the figure as if the letters and the digits had been introduced at a wedding. And in that odd little ceremony, I felt the strangest tenderness for the version of me who once believed she could barter her way into love by achieving on cue, which is a game you can never win because the goal line is attached to someone else's ego. So I stood, stretched, and let the room remember that it belonged to me. I set my phone to do not disturb because I knew the smoke signals would start drifting in from late-night insomniacs and friends of friends who suddenly remembered they had always believed, and in a small, entirely unnecessary flourish that made me grin, I changed my voicemail greeting to direct all business inquiries to my communications director and all personal messages to text because I was asleep, which was true in spirit if not in physiology, and also because it meant that if my mother or my brother called in a rush of performative pride, they would be greeted not by my voice, but by the professional distance they had insisted on for years. I lay back on the couch with the calm that follows a storm you decided not to chase, and in the thin quiet that lives between midnight and morning, the city hummed like a machine that knows its job, the embargo clock fully expired, the headline freshly minted, the interview packaged for replay before dawn, and somewhere across town, a table that had not saved me a seat was paying its check while a candle sputtered beside an empty dessert plate, and I knew, with the simple certainty of a person who finally stopped asking for permission, that by the time the sun decided to clock in, my phone would light up like a storefront on opening day, and the people who had edited me out of their celebration would suddenly remember my number as if it had been misplaced rather than ignored. The first vibration came before dawn, the kind of hour when only emergencies or mistakes justify waking someone, and for a split second I thought perhaps I had set an alarm by accident, but then another buzz followed, and another, until the phone became a nervous animal on the nightstand, leaping against the wood as if it had something urgent to confess. I let it dance while I stretched beneath the blanket, savoring the strange balance of exhaustion and adrenaline that comes only when the world finally collides with the secret you have been holding like contraband. By the time I reached for the screen, there were already more than 40 notifications stacked like dominoes, messages from cousins I had not spoken to in months, from distant acquaintances who once rolled their eyes at my persistence, from college classmates who used to whisper about my unrealistic ambitions, and threaded among them with theatrical regularity, the frantic insistence of my family group chat suddenly awakened to the revelation that their invisible daughter had been sitting on a mountain they never thought to climb. The group chat had transformed overnight from a place of birthday reminders and passive-aggressive logistics into a shrine of belated pride. "We're so proud of you," one line read, stripped of punctuation as if urgency alone could replace sincerity. "Why didn't you tell us?" another demanded, though the tone carried more accusation than curiosity, as if my crime was withholding the performance of success rather than enduring the humiliation of their silence. My brother's contribution stood out, not for its warmth, but for its precision. "Congrats on the deal, amazing stuff," the sort of language men use when cornered at the office water cooler, forced to compliment a rival's promotion while calculating how quickly they can pivot the subject. My father, who once suggested I consider teaching at a community college because at least that would count as stable, left a voicemail in which his voice cracked on the word remarkable, a slip that revealed more envy than love, while my mother sent a string of voice notes layered with theatrical pauses, her tone dripping with the sweetness of someone auditioning for forgiveness rather than offering it. I read them all without responding, each message a bead of irony I threaded into a necklace of proof that I had been invisible only until I became undeniable. The satisfaction was sharp, but it did not erase the ache, because beneath every sudden declaration of pride lived the unspoken truth that their love had always been conditional, tethered to public recognition like a balloon that floats only when filled with helium. For years I had begged for even the smallest gesture of support, and now, when cameras and anchors validated what they refused to see, they arrived like actors bursting through the wrong door, late to the scene, but determined to steal it anyway. I placed the phone face down and made coffee, pouring the water slowly, listening to the hiss and bubble, reminding myself that revenge, if taken in haste, burns bitter, but if brewed with patience, can taste like clarity. I carried the cup to the window and watched the street below come alive with joggers, delivery trucks, and school buses, each person moving through their own orbit, entirely unaware that a family across town had decided to rewrite me overnight. I thought about how many people wait their whole lives for applause that arrives only after someone else has stamped it with approval, and how little comfort it brings when you finally hear it from the mouths that once silenced you. When I returned to the phone, there were missed calls stacked like cards in a deck, each one a demand disguised as affection. My brother called twice, then texted, "Call me back ASAP." My mother left another message about arranging a dinner in my honor, as if the previous night's exclusion could be erased with an encore now that my worth had been notarized by the press. Even my aunt, who once joked at Thanksgiving that I was the artsy one who never quite landed, wrote, "We always knew you'd do something incredible." The audacity of the rewrite made me laugh, a long, unhurried laugh that rolled through the room until it turned into something steadier. Not quite joy, but not anger either, something closer to recognition that the moment I had imagined 1,000 times was here, and that I held the power to decide whether it would break me or crown me. So I decided to do nothing. I let the calls go unanswered, the texts pile up like unanswered invitations, the group chat bubble without a reply, because silence, when wielded intentionally, is not absence but strategy. I knew they would talk among themselves, speculating about my reaction, spinning stories about my schedule, convincing themselves I was too busy to respond, and in that gap between their questions and my silence, the truth would bloom. That I no longer needed to beg for a chair at their table, that the table itself had shrunk beneath the weight of their hypocrisy. By mid-afternoon, the messages softened into apologies disguised as logistics. "We'd love to set up a family dinner, whenever you're free," my father wrote, as if I had been the one too busy to attend the night before. "Let us celebrate you," my mother pleaded, her words collapsing under the weight of their sudden urgency. My brother, realizing pride would not suffice, pivoted to sarcasm, texting, "Guess the little hobby wasn't so little, huh?" I stared at the screen, the words hovering like gnats, and felt the peculiar calm of someone who has discovered that revenge does not always require an act, it sometimes requires only the refusal to act at all. For the first time in my life, I realized I had something they wanted more than I wanted them, and that imbalance, subtle and enormous, tilted the entire structure of our family dynamic. I did not rush to answer, I did not explain, I did not give them the satisfaction of hearing my voice tremble with anger or triumph. I simply closed the phone, poured another cup of coffee, and let the silence speak for me, because silence, when chosen, is louder than any applause they could have ever rehearsed. And in that silence, I understood with clarity sharper than any headline that the power I had spent my whole life chasing was not recognition, but the freedom to walk away without leaving a trace of myself begging at their door. By the time evening unrolled itself like a ribbon that had learned restraint, the barrage of messages had settled into a tremulous quiet, not because anyone had run out of things to say, but because they had finally understood that my reply, if it came at all, would not arrive as a performance delivered on their stage, and in that lull, fragile, almost ceremonial, I made the final arrangement that had been circling me all day like a possibility waiting for nerve, an arrangement that looked nothing like vengeance from the outside yet tasted exactly like justice on the inside, measured, dry, and undeniably earned. I called the same restaurant that had hosted their Achievers dinner and reserved the private room for a modest block of time, not to seat myself at the head of the table and preside over a parade of forced toasts, but to host a quiet scholarship reception for 6 young people from our old neighborhood who, like me, had been told that dreams should fit inside practical shoes, and I asked the manager to keep it simple, water pitchers, bread, the decent soup, because I wanted the room to be empty of spectacle and full of air, and I named the fund with a title so plain it became impossible to misinterpret. The Unsuccessful One Who Would Not Quit. Before I left my apartment, I drafted a single text to the family thread that neither begged nor boasted, a line designed to read like a courtesy and feel like a boundary. Thank you for the congratulations. I am not available for dinner, but I am hosting something small tonight for students who remind me of who I used to be. Please do not come. And then I silenced the thread, not out of cruelty, but to protect the small ceremony from the noise of people who love applause more than impact. The car ride across town moved through streets that had seen me walk them when I could not afford the ride, and I let the city play a highlight reel of the years no one bothered to narrate, the mornings with stale coffee and stubborn spreadsheets, the nights when I mistook exhaustion for failure, the Tuesdays when I ate noodles and pretended the ache was just hunger, and by the time the driver opened my door, I felt the kind of steadiness that does not announce itself, it simply shows up and holds the room. They trickled in wearing the anxious formality of people who worry they are about to be disqualified, and I shook hands, learned names, and listened as each of them told a version of the story I thought belonged only to me. The coach who told a girl that leadership looks better on boys, the supervisor who said passion does not pay rent and then borrowed her idea, the cousin who invited everyone but him to a celebration that was supposed to be about family, and as they spoke, I watched the private room become a small country with its own weather, where hunger for approval was replaced by appetite for the work itself, and where the only clinking was the sensible percussion of water glasses meeting, because everyone still had an early morning. I said a few words that fit the room, nothing scripted for broadcast, just a careful promise that the fund would pay for application fees, test prep, bus passes, and the unglamorous costs that bury ambition, and when the manager brought out a simple sheet cake, no fondant, no fireworks, and asked what a pipe on the top, I told him to write a sentence that had finally found its ending: eat, work, and do not wait for clapping. Halfway through the reception, my phone vibrated against the inside of my bag, a muted little heartbeat I ignored until the goodbyes had been exchanged and the selfies taken without ring lights, and when I finally looked, there it was. A collage of missed calls from my mother and father and brother, layered with a fresh message from my mother that read, "We're outside the restaurant. We thought we could join," which, depending on your temperament, was either persistence or siege, and I stood in the empty hallway and weighed the urge to finish the lesson with a door closed in their faces against the knowledge that some endings are more powerful when they do not slam. I walked to the host stand, thanked the manager for the evening, and left a tip that acknowledged the hush we had been granted. Then paused at the vestibule where the city pressed its face against the glass and my family's silhouettes waited like an old habit in expensive coats. I opened the first door and let the winter get a foothold, then held the second door closed with a palm and a smile that was warmer than it needed to be and harder than it looked, and I told them, through the thin pain and the professional smile of the host who suddenly understood the play, that we were closing up, that I appreciated the messages, that I had eaten with people who needed the seat more, that I wished them a good night, and that I would call when I was ready to talk, which might be soon, and might be never, and after I watched the confusion travel across their faces the way a cloud crosses a sun that does not apologize for shining, I stepped back into the lobby and let the doors reseal the room around me. On the ride home, I drafted one more message, this time for the public page everyone now pretended to have followed for years, a line that could be read as triumph by the hungry and warning by the observant, when the door finally opens. choose whether to walk in or build another, and I posted it without a photo because some nights do not ask for proof, they ask for posture. I unlocked my apartment, placed the invitation to their proposed celebration in the same drawer where I keep warranties for appliances I no longer own, and stood at the window long enough to watch the opposite building extinguish its squares of light one by one. And in that last quiet minute before sleep flattened everything into one long exhale, I let myself wonder, not with desperation, but with the gentle curiosity of someone who finally trusts her own ending, whether the next phone call I make to my family will be a beginning or an obituary, and I smiled at the not knowing, because the truth had already done its work, and the rest could live in the silence I had decided to keep.